Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm just doing this quick video to help you understand the progress and order and progress reading that was by the Penguin series about Brazil, and this is about the rise of Vargas. We started to talk about this in class last class, but you will have a post that you'll be given some time to work on in the beginning of class on Friday. So expect to do that. So check out the reading. You can annotate it if you want, so that way you can use the reading. A couple of things just to give you some structure to look for. One thing to note is the beginning of the First Republic. This is the time when Brazil in 1889 frees itself from the monarchy. It had been independent, but under a monarchy. And this is where we see a lot of flaws in the federalist system that gets created in 1889. And a lot of you discussed this in class. This is the politics of governors and this like kind of really significant state power that's much more significant than the central power. So we get these economically strong states that kind of rule Brazil. The reading refers to this as hyper-federalism because this is really focused on, where is the power base? It is focused on the, states like Sao Paulo that produce coffee, some of the states that have cattle ranching like Minas Gerais, and this really lends itself to a lot of various states and the people in those states being excluded from political power. We also see local strongmen, these colonels who play a role that basically distribute patronage, in exchange for votes. So this entire system is operating as layers of a political machine. And so the concept of republicanism isn't really present. And we also know that the vote is very, very small percentage. And so the public doesn't really have a strong voice, and some of this is related to a lack of literacy, which is built into the requirements for voting. And so there's this system for the presidency where there's a flip between these two leading states, and this system is kind of holding everything in check, but there's a lot of resentment, right? We know that there's a lot of pushback. Everyone outside of these economically dominant states, if you're not a coffee planter, you're not really becoming benefited by this entire system, and especially the poor, especially in the declining sugar states, especially in some of the rural agricultural areas. And we also get a rise of Catholicism and some conservatism, people who like rely on religion as a way to instill some sort of change or coping mechanism. So all kinds of pushbacks. We talked about coffee valorization in class. This starts earlier with Sao Paulo and some other leading states that are looking to artificially increase the price of coffee and hold it that way, basically by limiting supply. We know also that there's some fracturing in this agreement between, Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, and some of this is because of the rise of another state. This state is going to be Rio Grande do Sul, and the thing that Arturo Bernardes is really significant for. He is a business as usual candidate. He is going to be, somebody who is representative of this power base, in Sao Paulo. But he also sees a great deal of resistance. Once he is elected, there is resistance. And this is unusual because it's especially from a rising state that also has cattle ranching. So it's like possible that the state could have kind of went into a alliance in a sense with Sao Paulo and with Minas Gerais, but we start to see the cattle ranchers. Some of them are dividing away from the coffee planters. And so we get this like Democratic Party that is going to be a response. This is one example of a resistance movement to this like business as usual. This is in 1926, and think of it as like a Brazilian First Party. It's a response to Arturo Bernardes, who is like kind of the business business as usual figure. We also see intellectuals that really develop strong voices. Some of the intellectuals, we're talking artists, we're talking musicians, people who are creating samba, which is seen as something a little bit, almost like erotic, and something that becomes almost taboo, but then becomes culturally very significant to Brazil. And so there is this like way that there are a couple of questions circling amongst intellectuals. Certainly, we see a rise in socialism as a response. So some of these artists are going to be, Marxists who are going to look at maybe creating some type of socialist state. We also see some more right-wing fascist type plans. Some of the artists are going to move into that category, and writers. Some of the political parties will be started by a group of writers. So there is this kind of intellectual fervent, and some of this is also being influenced by the rise of Mussolini in Italy. So this kind of identity of fascism as like the state as the most important thing to be loyal to, individuality second, kind of the state is most significant, and the way in which that kind of gets, focused on. So we see a little bit of like a nationalism. And then there's also questions in this like art movement about, what does it mean to be Brazilian in 1920? So it feels somewhat reminiscent of maybe like the Harlem Renaissance, where these questions, and of course in Brazil, there's a much larger demographic of individuals who are either mixed race or race in terms of Black Brazilians. So this identity question is very focused on in art. What is it? What do Brazilians what kind of identity do they have? And is it European, or is it something else that's uniquely Brazilian? And that's kind of a big conversation. And we see that in some of these arts, where in some cases, some artists are maybe, emphasizing race and African identity. In this particular work of art, five girls from Guaratinguera. I'm sorry that I, butchered that, but we're getting, kind of a representation of maybe women from a variety of different races, but it's kind of celebrated. There's some of that conversation going on. And there's also some art that speaks to the experience of workers, especially workers who are going to be exploited in this space where banana plantations, coffee plantations, Brazil's export industry is, there's a heavy price. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. One additional space where we see this is in the area of the Amazon with rubber production. Some of this will eventually get replaced by rubber production in places like Malaysia, but ultimately the worker and the low wage worker becomes a significant topic of discussion amongst intellectuals. There's also the Tenentes revolt, and when you think of Tenentes, think of this as like the military, which always has a significant role in the political system in Brazil. Even during some of that time where the state has a great deal of power, the military is playing a role, and that system works as long as there's order. But the reading that you have suggests that something shifts and changes. Some of this is because there is some bad mouthing of military members in the press, but some of this is also just a resistance to this notion that one or two states have all of the power. And some of these tenentes, right, the soldiers, go on this massive march. So it's a very visual resistance movement, and some of the soldiers also travel through some of the more rural parts of Brazil. And arguably, this creates like a little bit movement left of some of the military members. There's also a lot of resentment for this coffee valorization program, which only becomes bigger and bigger the more coffee becomes unstable. So by the time we get to 1929 and the stock market crash, where the price of coffee just bottoms out, there's a great deal of debt that is being accrued fund in order to support very wealthy coffee planters who have all the political power, and there becomes increasing, resentment. So all of this debt is creating a huge debt payment for Brazil. So a lot of the money that is being raised in the country is going to the payment of debt, so that the coffee prices can remain artificially high. And so this becomes, an unsustainable type of economic system, and it only will get exacerbated in 1929 with the stock market crash. And so coffee decreases in price from 22 cents, to 15 cents a pound, and this is going to set up the society for organization around some political parties. And some names to kind of be familiar with is Washington Luis, Julio Prestes, and Vargas, Getulio Vargas, because these are people who are going to be involved in what becomes a military coup in 1930. Essentially, how does this happen? I'll go back to this slide for a second, so I'm just going to mention this kind of quickly. Washington Luis is like a business as usual candidate. He's supposed to, step down because presidents in Brazil are only allowed to serve one term. That's something that was like kind of a weakness of presidential power in the Constitution. The next candidate, kind of typically would come from not Sao Paulo, but Minas Gerais and Minas Gerais, and that area is not going to send a president, much to their chagrin. We're going to get another Paulista, and that's Prestes. So like Washington Luis is going to pick his his next in line, and it's going to be Prestes, and this is going to make a lot of people upset. So Prestes never takes power. He is kind of like somebody who is selected to be the next president. He isn't kind of given that power because the military will install their chosen candidate, who has created a party called the Liberal Alliance. And the thing to know about the Liberal Alliance and Vargas's party, he is very much kind of like the anti-Paulista party. So it kind of entertains this very, very large tent of people, many, many different groups that are not necessarily like-minded, but are left and are right, who like don't like the Paulistas. So they come together, and there is, in a sense, something for everybody. Vargas is going to be like a little bit on the left, and he's also going to be a little bit on the right, and then ultimately very, very authoritarian. But this kind of combination creates some challenges, and even amongst historians who look back, like, what did he actually accomplish? It's a mixed bag of a variety of things, because he's got this very, very wide and diverse political group that he has to kind of entertain. And it's like kind of an anti-Paulista, party for the most part. He takes power. Vargas is a picture of Vargas in 1930. He is provisional president. The military essentially puts him in power, so he's not an elected president. He takes the country away from exports into something that you should like jot in your notes and know: ISI, or import substitution industrialization. This is basically, there's an economy that's going to be built within Brazil for the purpose of making domestic products at home. So relying less on producing products for export, but relying more on making products at home. And so this is going to require, basically, from Vargas, a great deal of state power. So we're going to see Vargas kind of use the tools of the state to organize what becomes a very state-led industrialization. And in some ways, this is going to have some very positive effects, because it's going to lead to a lot of investment into Brazil, a lot of investment into labor in some ways, and industrialization. It will create a great deal of wealth, especially for the bourgeoisie, the group of people that didn't like the wealthy planters from, Sao Paulo. This is like a rising middle class of industrialists. They are huge fans of Getulio Vargas, okay? And we do see that there is a revolt a Paulista revolt. Okay, so there will be an attempt to try to take down Vargas's power, but ultimately Vargas has some military support behind him, and he will crack down on the various revolts. And this is something that will get accentuated in his term for power, which he will be in power until 1945. Then there's a break, and then he comes back. He's actually elected again, and then until the time of his death, where he dies by suicide. I'm going to stop here, and then I'll pick up the video in the next few minutes.